In the New York City public service system, the government is run by two unique but equally vital groups: the elected and appointed officials who design initiatives, and the employees tasked with implementing them. These are their stories. Dun dun! Hey everyone, and welcome to a new episode of Civil Conversations. I am so happy to welcome Tiffany as my guest today. She is another Brooklynite, but born and raised, very proud Brooklynite. So welcome, Tiffany. Happy to have you on. She has worked in city government for close to 15 years and worked in youth and community development and sort of program planning and community engagement for close to 25 years. And is someone that I had worked with previously, and a person who I've continued to keep in touch with is just a great colleague, friend, and a badass woman that I know seeks to do great work and be a great person, an advocate, a steward for change and just positivity in the city workforce. And so I'm so happy to welcome you. One, blessed to have you in my life, and so grateful to have you join me today. So welcome.
Thank you for having me. I'm
Of
really
course.
excited to be here.
Of course, happy to have you. So, as you all know, the context of this show is to bring in people who work in city government to get insights and to gain context, right? To glean from their experiences, to bring them to light and kind of see how sort of things that we encounter in working in bureaucracies and government structures from those that do that work day to day, how we can bring that to life and bring their stories and elevate and amplify their voices. And so, you among many others who have had on the show, and I'm so grateful to have you on, are people who have inspired this show, people who, despite, sometimes dealing with obstacles and challenges, just continue to sort of push on and dredge on in the purpose and the mission, right, of supporting people through public service. So I want to just give you huge kudos to that. And also just sort of, again, make that connection that you are one of those people who inspired me to do this. So thank you so much. So I wanted to give some context, and this is something that we had come up with in one of our past episodes in my conversations with John, and just in sort of my broader thinking with this new election. It's an election year, and the potential to have new leadership, which is looking more and more likely these days here in New York City government. And we're going to have a wide array of mayoral candidates in the mix. And things are kind of in a bit currently, I think, in a tumultuous place in New York City with our mayor experiencing a lot of controversy in his term. We've had indictments, revolving door and key leadership positions, a lot of people in non-leadership positions sort of resigning and moving on, and the city having a staffing crisis that's lasted for a few years now. And all of that has kind of been a major distraction, right, from important, meaningful work, and therefore, right, a distraction from making progress and getting those outcomes that we know are necessary. So I wanted to first acknowledge in thinking about this in terms of like, okay, we're going into an election term and we're going to be needing new leadership. One of the things that just came to mind is like, what does this even mean in terms of this job? Just sort of like stepping back in a real big way and zooming out and thinking about what this really entails and what the demands are. And that's something that's kind of been alluded to in past sort of discussions with John and others on the show, because this is like essentially a mayor is a CEO, right, of the largest city in the country, right? Like they're the chief executive in charge of, doing a slew of things. And for, again, like something, I think a place that the whole world is always looking at. So just in thinking more about their capacity, their focus, and what that impact has on just, again, the things that we're able to accomplish in the city. What's the demand in your time? Like sometimes I step aside, like a lot of people, I think, in the news and people who are running think they know what it means to be the mayor of New York City, but like, do you really understand what it means to be the mayor of New York City? I can only imagine the demand on someone's time and your energy, right? Because we know like that's doing this on a day to day is exhausting as it is, but I can only imagine that like amplified by 1,000. And what's the breadth of the role? You have over 8 million residents that live in New York City. It's a major international business and tourist hub. So it means you have a lot of people cycling in and out of here. In terms of tri-state relations, you probably have to negotiate with places like New Jersey, Pennsylvania, sort of maintaining those relationships, Connecticut, all the sort of thoroughfares and connection points, working with New York State. Like I was even thinking this morning of, you have city council members that those are the folks you work with at the city level, but you're also working with state senators that cover your district and then working with state folks to sort of negotiate and barter in some instances, right? For some of your initiatives. So it's like New York sort of, again, is a whole nother level, and then working with all those political representatives. We see now working with the federal government and the consequences of whether you have a good relationship or a bad relationship. And also thinking, New York is an international hub. We have the United Nations, all these delegates from different countries, again, because a lot of sort of activity happens here. And then if you're thinking at a real micro level in terms of the operations of the city, I'm thinking, okay, if something happens in the subway, you're responsible for it. If something happens on a bus, you're responsible for it, right? All of public transit. We have the largest school system in the country. If something happens in a classroom, something happens in a school building, if generations are not graduating, you're responsible for it. We have crisis response, so in terms of like emergency management, floods, preparing for anything like that, and any other crisis that happens, like a guy shooting the CEO of United Healthcare. You're expected to be there and to respond to that. Public safety, sort of speaking about that, and folks like out in the streets and PD and fire departments and those types of school general sort of like safety and well-being services that falls under a mayor's purview. Infrastructure planning and management, like thinking about initiatives that have cycled through your parks, your waterfronts, right, your subways, your buildings and your housing. All of that again is a responsibility of the mayor. Economic development and planning, how are you getting jobs into the city, how are you attracting tourists, businesses, restaurants, those regulations, the letters on the buildings, right? The what is that? The outdoor dining. That's all. I think again comes down to some of the mayoral purview and oversight. Healthcare, of course, public health care, our hospitals, child welfare. If something happens, unfortunately, to a child, the folks look at the agencies and the mayor to sort of answer as to why these things are happening and why certain children are falling through the cracks. Incarceration in our justice system, that's been in the news quite a bit lately, and like Rikers potentially having a federal takeover, again, something that falls under the mayor's purview. Waste management, our trash, the rats, water treatment, is our water clean? So much. And I think the list could go on and on and on and on. And like, holy shit, like who would want to take that job? I just want to say that. Like, who would even want to do that? So, it's crossed my mind again that this is a really big job with great expectations, right? And so that has sort of led to this conversation to sort of reflect and articulate, like, what should we be looking for in our next leader as a city? What norms do we need to sort of set up to bring back authenticity and realness to this role? And maybe a better operational focus, right? So this is something we could talk about in a minute, but I feel like more and more we've kind of gotten wrapped up in the who is in city government as opposed to why people are in city government. And then really thinking, is this all reasonable to be with one person all at the same time? So it's a lot. Okay. So I just hit you with a lot, but that's something I sort of wanted to start thinking about. And again, you've worked in city government now for 15 years, but been around it for longer, right? As someone who had to work with the city to get your work done for now, over 25 years. And so that was a lot. What sort of resonates with you and what sticks out? What are your reactions?
Wow. So the immediate thing that I think about is in reference to leadership is from my experience, um, agencies, companies, nonprofits, doesn't matter. Having a very effective SOP, standard operating procedures and checks and balances really do make a difference.
Mhm.
Um, and I'm not sure that every single, city agency follows a standard SOP. And I wondered if they did, if that was made a standard by, the next mayoral leader, how how better that we would function as a city,
Mhm.
how much better city agencies would lean in on each other and excuse me, really do more of a connected or connectivity between the resources that they have and how
Yeah.
to better serve the actual city. For an example, something that pulls on my heartstrings is whether I'm in the city or in another borough, I feel like there's been an uptick in homeless people
Mm.
on the streets. And I feel considering the amount of money or fiscal budget for our city, there should be no reason why anyone in this great city should be homeless. right? In conversations with other people, they are feeling very anxious, unsure uh, about the migrant
Mhm.
situation as well, and the resources that it takes to facilitate helping migrants, but also folks thinking that the folks who actually live here haven't been served either.
Mhm.
So, where's the disconnect? And if it can be addressed, why not address it from the bottom up? So, I know that this position that you just carefully and thoroughly ran down is a massive amount of duty for one person.
Mhm.
And so I know currently there are, deputy mayors, and those are the folks who are supposed to help with the oversight of certain compartments of the city. I'd be curious to know how one how do they operate officially?
Mhm.
Meaning not the kind of support, because I've actively seen deputy mayors provide a wealth of support and knowledge in supporting agencies or whoever's underneath their preview. But then on other respects, there's still the disconnect between certain agencies and how we could do a better job with serving the families of New York City. Um, you know, from after school programming to summer camps to community development work to working with young fathers and young mothers. It's great work that we are doing, but I think it needs more. And I've
Mhm.
seen over this past year there's been a little bit more of that, but to your point, the distraction of all the behind the scenes that have now been brought to light, it makes me question what's the checks and balance system before anyone actually officially assumes their role.
Mhm.
And if it is not adequate, then I think that would be something that would need to change or should change before we have a next mayor.
Yeah.
Likelihood of that happening, definitely not sure. But I'd love to see a leader who invokes the true meaning of what it is to be a leader. How are they choosing their team
Yeah.
to help run this city? I'm hoping that there'll be some, aspects of, change management, like really getting the buy-in from the team. Everyone is clear on what their roles are,
Yeah.
the capacity that there's actually full on teams because there's also a shortage of jobs
Yeah.
in a lot of city agencies, and we're doing sometimes a job of two or three to keep this city running. And I know that that's been an echo for a lot of leaders running their city agencies. Is we're still doing the work.
Mhm.
Let's not be distracted because the work that we do is important. And for some agencies, the work that's being done is the balance between life or death, and that's very, very serious.
Yeah.
I'm gonna pause there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was amazing. A lot of gems. And it's so true. I think we're in a time and space right now at a national level where I think the value and the nature of government is really maybe a little bit skewed or unclear, right? Like, why are we chopping jobs? I'm sure at the federal level, many people would say, yeah, we could do a lot more if we had more people working in federal government or better systems or better operations or better leadership, right? It's not the individuals that are there per se, but maybe a lack of support and intentional planning and strategy to all the things that you said earlier. So, I've been thinking about that a lot lately of like people really need to understand the beauty of government because it's exactly what you said. Like, would the world go on if we didn't have, certain branded cars? Yes, the world would still go on. Would the world still go on if we weren't sending out rockets, test missions to Mars? Yes, the world would go on. However, if you're talking about people who are sleeping in the street, people who don't have access to healthcare, kids who don't have safe after school programs, kids who are not getting sound education, those things have consequences, right? If your water is not clean, those things have consequences. So yes, to your point, um, government. is important, right? And it means life or death to some people. Think about even emergency response. Like if you do it with an agency like FEMA, did we hear crazy stories during like Hurricane Katrina and see like the horrific things that happened when they didn't respond? Yes,
Yes.
but that doesn't mean that you don't need them, right? It just means they need to be better. And so that was such a an amazing and crucial point. And you said a couple of things earlier too, and I really want to hone in on this there's definitely like sort of this question about operational management, I think, sort of getting back into values, I think, which connects to like priorities, right? So I want to talk about that. And then like qualifications and how you work with people. So thinking about that, like if you were to interview a CEO, right, what this person brings to the table, what they've done in the past, like what company did they come from, what successes were they able to accomplish, do they know how to work with board members, do they know how to make money, do they know how to do change management to turn this company around if it's in a state of, sort of disarray.
Mhm.
Those are things that but elected officials, we don't have that. I don't think as much. You have this executive sort of title, but it seems a little bit more of like a beauty pageant, perhaps, of like people who get attention and can say the right things at times when eyes are on them to get these roles. And it's not to negate, I don't want to sound like a total asshole and like negate all the things that people do to get into these positions. However, let's be honest, right? Like a lot of it is name recognition. Like Andrew Cuomo just came into the mix and that threw everything up into the air, right? And why is that? Probably mostly name recognition. And it's a little scary. But I wanted to sort of elevate this and talk about this a little bit more because when you said this, it made my heart sing because I 1000% agree about operating and managing and doing change management. So, when it comes to selecting people to head agencies, these are often, I think, and we'll love to hear, what your experience has been. But for me, it seems more of like this relationship kind of selection of people. So if you're talking about, I have this ginormous job, right? I should be selecting. I mean, let me even step back one step further. If I have this ginormous job, we don't know what qualifies someone to hold that job. And this came up in our last episode. Like, what does it even mean to be mayor of New York City, right? Like, what qualities should you have? What training should you have? What knowledge? Do you know budgets? Should you know budgets? Do you know about like city council relationships? Do you need to know about city council relationships? Do you have, state policy? Do you need that, right? There's all these kind of qualifications that I think we could really ask. But even more so, I agree with you 1000%, the people that you surround yourself with, right? So are you making these selections based on friendships and loyalty, right? Which I think is what happened this mayoral administration for the most part. Or are you selecting people who really are qualified to do that work that they're tasked with? If it's DEP, do you know shit about managing water? If it's Department of Transportation, do you know anything about the transportation and the verticals? Education, same thing. So I kind of wanted to focus on that a little bit more. And then kind of talking about certain experiences around that because I do think as like a CEO, your job is to, right, make sure that your operation runs smoothly. But I do think that as of late, it is more about the people, not so much about the focus on the why, right? Like, why are people there? What are we asking them to do? And what happens if they don't accomplish that? Like, I definitely feel like that's lost. So I kind of want to talk about that a little bit more.
Hmm. Um, you make really good points. I think about when it's voting season and how only during that time will you see a rush of either ads, commercials, postings going up. I know at a certain time I receive the booklet in the mail that gives sort of a small snapshot of each candidate who's running for a certain position. And then you have to read this, and only from that are you able to make an informed decision that influences what you put on your ballot, right? But
Mhm.
I think that is a great start, but I'm not sure what happens after that. So after you vote and after we hear who won and who lost, I agree. I think that there should be something that is very transparent in letting New Yorkers and families know what what's this person's resume, like taking a deeper dive into that, and then also being able to access that information freely, uh, but also being mindful of those who do not have access to a lot of digital technological devices, but they still need to be in the know of what's happening, especially if it's impacting their actual community, right? Because this person's supposed to be representing
Yep.
your values and your beliefs and your concerns and working on that. But I can't say that I've ever seen or noted after an election, okay, so what's the agenda? How do we know that you're truly capable of this? And where is it that I can get this information if I'm ever looking for it?
Yeah.
Also, I'm not sure how many people know that in their own community that they can provide their voice and feedback about what's happening in certain platforms and forums. I don't think a lot of people know about that. They're free. You don't
Mhm.
need anything. You just, show up and you're a resident of the area, and you can give that feedback. I wonder how valuable or how much more valuable that would be to actually be able to know not only where my representative's office is, but who are all the people that work for them,
Yeah.
right? From the chief of staff to, other representation. I don't know what, not me per se, but I don't believe that everyone knows exactly who now that elected official, what their team is, who their team is, the same way in which for, mayoral leader has now a full force team that looks over things. I think that we should know what each person is responsible for and what they're doing and
Mhm.
get a better understanding of their approach. I think if we had a better understanding of why and how people move, we'd have a better understanding. I think that New Yorkers are capable of understanding that information, and it may actually answer a lot of the, surface questions that people have. Uh, in case in point, using the homelessness example again, does anybody know how many shelters are in New York City? They are filled to the capacity.
Mhm.
There is a lot of, housing. Our housing crisis is ridiculous. And everywhere you turn around, in some area, you are seeing a new building go up. So now you have gentrification coming into that area, but displacing the people who live there. And those kind of choices actually spill over into other areas of people's lives where it could actually impact someone and they end up being homeless because they could not afford
Mhm.
to live anywhere here in New York City. Why
Mhm.
not utilize some of those sites or new construction areas to build out, accessible information hubs, uh, provide I saw this on TV once and I thought it was really cool about how other states are handling their homelessness crisis. And there's a real thing that some people choose to be homeless. Like they feel like that is the best fit for them. But wherever it is that they go, there are like showers and bathrooms that they can,
Mhm.
clean themselves and refresh themselves and then go along their merry way. Where are the small steps to making those incremental changes?
Yeah.
I'm not sure that I see them everywhere that I go,
Yeah.
especially when I'm traveling around, with the city. So,
And
in terms of the operation there, like how to operationalize access points, getting information out, attributing to connecting all the dots so that people, understand there's just so much misinformation that's going on and being shared. Uh, you can't stop it. People are going to have their views, which they are completely entitled to. but there should be no reason why when we are walking our streets or we are looking for advocacy, or we are trying to get a better understanding of why do people want to run in the first place? What do you get out of once you win?
Mm.
Um, what are you entitled to,
Yeah.
right? And not to go off, kilter, but having another
No, totally.
conversation, um, about the government and how they're representing us. There are some elected officials from the last voting go around, um, that won. And I don't know the salary for each, federal or local state position. I don't know how much council members make. I don't know how much senators make either. But it's very, very interesting that Jane, who lives in her neighborhood and she's active, and she's doing all this out of the love of her heart and whatnot, and maybe she gets the base salary. But how in the world are elected officials worth millions of dollars, just a few years after they've been elected?
Yeah.
But
It's
the people that they serve, that money doesn't come, unless
yeah.
there's something I've missed. But if you are receiving education, professional development, that's one too. Do our elected officials and their teams, do they consistently receive professional development that really speaks to the responsibility that they play in our communities?
That would
That
make
is
sense.
fascinating to know, right? And not just
Yeah.
one time, but ongoing. Maybe
Yeah.
it's a way of checks and balances to see, are you taking what you've learned and how are you implementing that?
Yeah.
What does it look like? Are you, regularly um, getting feedback? Are you making assessments of the success, or are you tweaking things because you see that the need now has evolved and changed?
Yeah. I mean, this sort of speaks to certain again, like this sort of idea of great expectations, right? Like I think that using that as an example, I think that's a great idea and something that agencies, leaders, right, no matter what position you're in, they should be taking that time to do that. And then I think on the flip side, how many times have we seen, I can tell you I saw it on my end when I worked at the Department of Education, that there were articles written criticizing the agency for spending money on space, which was needed because you had 160,000 people working at that time for the Department of Education. So, where are you going to train thousands of teachers who are starting in a school year? You don't do that in an auditorium that at the time probably didn't have AC, that was also hosting summer school. Like, there's some things that are possible and some that aren't. And the agency, has to give this response as to why we're quote unquote wasting taxpayer dollars on space and professional development, and how dare we feed people if they're there all day for 3 days? Like, it's asinine, right? So I say that extremely sarcastically, because if it were JP Morgan Chase that does a retreat in Connecticut for their senior leaders, that would be okay because they're JP Morgan Chase. But then why do we not allow that for people who are in charge of, as you so astutely mentioned earlier, things that affect someone's, many people's, in this case millions of people's daily lives, right? And the services they get and the health and safety of their neighborhood, their housing, etc. So yeah, that's like one thing that I think, to your point of like developing norms,
Mm.
that's another thing that I think sometimes is a little of an unreal and unfair expectation, that people cannot dedicate money for that purpose in city government, because just like anyone else, we need consultants to help us strategize if we know people who can like step out of the box and help us, or like you said, bring in someone from another city or town that did this really well to kind of give us advice on how we can approach it differently. So I think that is amazing, and then I think that also sets sort of like a, like we're turning the mirror a bit, less on the leadership, but also on citizens and media, to really understand and put themselves in this position, right? Looking at it from a different angle and kind of giving a bit of grace to not see it as like dollars so much and an opportunity to criticize, but like really understanding the value that something like that can add, right, to the work that people are doing. But again, I think that's communication. I think that's having an articulated strategy, like you said. So it's not like people just going out to, Puerto Rico and, schmoozing and bullshitting for a few days, but like actually this is part of a broader strategic plan to do X, Y, and Z in the city or build up leadership or build up, relationships. Like I agree with you. And going back to sort of operational point, um, this CEO or when mayors come in, I sort of, and this is probably wrong of me to say, again, I'm sounding a bit like an a hole, but it makes my skin crawl when I see people out for photo and video opportunities, because that seems to be more of like what a mayor is expected to respond to. It's like if some big news is happening, I need to be there. But then who is moving things behind the scenes, like really doing that goal setting, really looking at getting qualified people into agencies and giving them metrics or at least some types of like goals or mandates that you can then, kind of hold them accountable to. Like, who is the behind the scenes operations person? And I'm sure probably, I did a little research this morning, like, New York City mayors, they're sort of like the buck,
Mhm.
stops with them. So you are responsible at the end of the day, but I think it takes a little bit of maturity and again, sort of being transparent and real with people that one person can't do all these things, right? And really talking about elevating and having key people, right? And talking about the work that they're doing, so it's not like the, oh, if you don't see me out, shaking hands and kissing babies, that I'm working, really kind of setting those norms. Or if you see me out and about, there's someone who is, kind of making sure the work moves forward. And so I personally have seen like a lot of missed opportunities. And I want to go back to your point of like selecting people thoughtfully. I think, again, giving them clear mandates and making sure that agencies are connecting and streamlining. So, like when I think of a good leader of a company, right, or a nonprofit or any organization, even if you're thinking at a team level, you should be coming in and saying what is working, what isn't working, and what are we trying to do and how do we get there. And I feel like a lot of when new people come in, because again, it's your name and either you want to get reelected or to your earlier point, right, move into a different role. My goal is to be mayor so I can be a state senator or to be a US senator or to be president. People have had their sort of like a legacy with pipeline, I think, intentions. But really, I do think if you're going to do this, and I think that's the one thing that's really missing is stepping back and looking at the operations, even if it's not you that's doing it. If you're talking about doing a good job, you have to step back and look and see and be that CEO, right? Like that executive person that is doing that assessment, taking the time to do it, right? And being very transparent with people. Because another thing you said was sort of, and I think goes to his great expectations, people want you to get results and they want them fast. But let me ask you, in your experience, anything good that's happened in city government, was it done quickly? Anything? Very few things. You can speak to
Uh,
that, I don't know. But I feel like
so
any good thing takes time, right? Like, it's
it
like a seed
does.
you have to plant in a garden and you have to give it time to grow. Yes, there's events you can do and, like, little things that can have sort of a short-term effect, but, like, meaningful things take time, and I think sometimes we set up these unfair expectations that someone comes in
I agree.
and, it needs to just be like, right away, homelessness is gone. Right away, the streets are clean. Right away, schools are good. Like, that's not realistic. But sorry, you're gonna say something.
No, it made me think about, um, you know, initiatives that are created to help address an issue, let's say, violence in some areas, like where there's really high violence. And I the initiatives, the turnaround time to facilitate and implement them is in certain times unrealistic, especially for the results that leadership is wanting to see. And then everything has to be backed by numbers, right? Because that's the marker. How many people are we impacting? How many are we serving? Like connecting the dollar to set individual for the outcome. And sometimes I don't know if the outcomes are necessarily realistic in nature, especially for the timeline that's given. And I wonder if it does any justice to operate like that.
Mhm.
I've seen that in some cases it doesn't. And talking to your point about, thoughtful implementation or strategizing for those points, more of that needs to be done. There are amazing ideas, yes, to help improve. Wonderful. And glad that folks are actually thinking about that. But I don't think they take enough time to think about the implementation on the actual ground, right? And I wonder if on the ground level they are really getting real feedback from New Yorkers about what the need is, because then when the money is shelved out and then we have to then push for this initiative to start and end, and then you look at us and say, well, how come the numbers are so low?
Mhm.
Well, it's an effect, right? It's not
Right.
something, that people take enough time to think about all of the components and the gears that go into, all of this, and the fact that there are people who are pushing this and they're working hard already, considering, the state of, the city and of the world. And there's a lot of fear now that has, taking over because of a lot of movements that are happening very quickly that feel to be taking away from um, a lot of beautiful strides that we've made as a society to be, more social, more impactful, more intentional, understanding the importance of inclusivity and also diversity. Like those things are we're seeing just kind of like wiped away, and we're human. I believe that at the core of, every leader, whether, mayoral leader, whether local elected official, assembly person, at the core of the work, it's human service. I feel like
Yeah.
people are forgetting the fact that we are human. We have processes, right? We process. I love the fact that there's also now been a shift in the last recent years about mental health, right?
Mhm.
Because that is a real thing that impacts a lot of people, a lot of children, and a lot of adults. So when you think about this, where this is human service work, you wouldn't approach, someone in a certain way, person like on your personal life versus your professional. You have to think about um, putting back the empathy
Mhm.
into the work, right? Um, Meeting people where they're at. What does that really mean? Because
Yeah.
there's a lot of coaching that has to happen when you say meet people where they're at. Because where people are at could be way out of your scope to help support them.
Yeah.
However, if every community or if every leader who's overseeing districts, or even for the mayoral leader, is really strategizing about what are the top priorities that we should be addressing. How are we really getting feedback from folks? What does a need assessment really look like on a massive level for cities, right? Or
Mhm.
whatever pilots that need to show up. But I think that you really need to hear what's happening on the ground to inform the work that you want to do to change,
Yeah.
because the buy-in comes from the people, the residents who live in communities. And if they don't know what you're doing, it's really unlikely that they're going to get on board to try and
Right.
do things.
Yeah. And I think it's important to know their asks. They need to know what you're doing, but also too being nimble enough. Or I'd actually say like there's this mental health component, but also like a self awareness kind of. I think that's growing a little bit more in the world. And actually, let me not say that. Some people really lack it. Okay, some people really
A
do, but
lot of people, it really grinds my gears of
oh hell
how
yeah,
people do not have self-awareness or mindfulness.
yeah,
A small little thing that could
yeah,
really make an impact about paying that forward.
yeah.
Oh,
Yeah. And talking about human services, right? Like self awareness is a big thing. And the reason why I mentioned that is when you were speaking about sort of like, and you said this earlier as well, you're doing community work and there's platforms or venues where you can go share your feedback. Or if you're doing a survey or a needs assessment, you can do those things. And I don't know if you've ever encountered this, but I encountered this a lot over the past couple years where I've gone to these meetings and they're absolute waste of my time. I share something and no one could give a shit less what I have to say and nothing happens with it, right? So I think to that point too, it's like you also need to hear people but be responsive. Like, yes, I think what you're saying, you need to do that needs assessment. You need to meet people where they are. And maybe you can't address everything because you're 1000% right. Like, there's only so much people can do. Like, I think the other part of being human that doesn't get acknowledged enough in city government here, you're dealing with 8 million people. There is no policy. I'm just being honest, and I would love to be surprised. And someone like tell me, Liz, we proved you wrong. But there is no policy that's going to meet everyone's needs or everyone's expectations or everyone's beliefs or everyone's priorities, right? Like speaking about the migrant crisis, some people believe adamantly that money should be spent there and other people don't. Some people adamantly believe that we should be covering homeless services. Some may not. Some may think we need to focus heavily on education. Others not. Some people may think now a big topic is like universal childcare. And then I look at advocacy for money for aging adults in New York
Mm,
City. And it's like, again, there's always competing priorities. That I think it's hard to sort of land on something that meets everyone's needs. But I think hearing people acknowledging, sharing what you're prioritizing, that you hear it, but you'll get to it later, or like why you can't do it, I think makes a big difference. And it's almost like, yeah, it's like this dog and pony show. We got your feedback. And give you another example. And I could like speak about this forever. They had a series of hearings about mayoral control last January, not this January. I think it was the January before. Trek all the way out to a remote part of Brooklyn. Again, speaking about events, you have to do everything in a free space, right? Packed with people, okay? And everyone had 2 minutes. But I'm telling you, people were there until 10, 11 o'clock at night, hearing folks all like really probably 99% of the attendees there talking about how that model does not support our schools and all the ways that they may touch it as advocates, as students, as parents, as educators, what have you. And what did they wind up doing? Keeping it. No timeline of, we heard this feedback and we're going to be making these changes, or we acknowledge that 99% of the people who came said this isn't working, but we can't change it right away, which I would respect. You can't change one thing from day to the next, but at least acknowledge that and then make a plan to say we're going to be phasing it out. But that was nothing. It's like almost like business as usual. So you spent millions of dollars to host these events because you did have to pay for permits and custodians and translators and, pay the people who were there. You spent money to host that to what? Maintain the status quo. Like that's like such a big slap in the face. And how many times do people encounter that as constituents and then people internally as workers, right? You may have brilliant ideas and then we can't do that because we have to maintain the status quo, and that I had to say that because like maybe it's just frustrating, right? Like if you're going to be you do need to be strategic, like all those things. But you need to engage people and like really act on it. And this goes back again to my sort of pulling this out of us getting lost in the who, right? And not the why. Like the human part of it is the why, right? Why these agencies exist, why this sector exists, why people are employed or elected to help people is because of the human things that come up in 8 million people, right? Living here, breathing here, working here, going to school here, what have you. But more and more, I feel like we're focused on the who and not the why. As an example, you know, we are going to maintain mayoral control because, Kathy Hochul is trying to maintain a good relationship with Adams at the time. Or if she doesn't, it has consequences for her reelection. That's focusing on the who and their politics and their maneuverings, not the why we do education, right? Or, this person who's in charge appoints this person who is their friend. That is a who decision, not a why decision, because this person knows about homelessness or has experienced homelessness or has helped lead an agency that addressed, an equally sort of challenging, human service area. So like that I think is a big thing of like whoever comes in
mm,
should be focusing more on the why, not on the who. Um So I just wanted to say that.
No, I totally I receive what you're saying. Um,
I'm
mo
sorry. That really grinded my gears. I was like, "Whoa."
most definitely, and I know without a shadow of a doubt that there are, active community leaders, who are always pushing for change, even if it's not within the scope after you've had the $1 million, session to hear everybody's feedback. But they you can only control what you can control, right? And
Yeah.
what you're working with. And people manage, these community leaders somehow manage to do so. However, I back to, operationalizing and being, fully transparent, but also sharing the information on different platforms that speak to uh, person's different access to information. I feel as if part of those meeting and or town halls that are happening where you're receiving the information, I think once you receive that information and your team is processing that, then there should be a strategic plan put in place. And whether that strategic
Mhm.
plan is going to be a 1 to 3 year plan to work those things out. Okay, great. Then after that's settled, you come back to the community and you share out what the results are. Or if you don't have the capacity to do that, then assign those community leaders to be able to disseminate that information, right? Or hold forums in particular communities where if it's about education or enrichment, you host it at a high school, or you do maybe newsletters to a certain degree, right? So that periodically there is something coming out that's attesting to the progress of the feedback that everyone has shared. And so if they can see it and touch it and feel it, then they feel as if their voices are being heard, because at the end of the day, that's all people really want,
Yeah.
is that I feel like I was heard. I
Right.
feel that you validated my feeling about my concern about what's going on for me and my family and the people that I live around. And then once you do that, all I want you to do is show up and help us figure out what to do.
Yep. Yep. I love that. So I am being mindful of time because we could sit here probably for like 2 more hours talking about this easily. But I would love to have you back on to continue this conversation. I think big things that I took away, one is to pick good people, right? If you are going to be a leader, and assuming and understanding and acknowledging that this is a role that has very high expectations and a huge mandate, right? The breadth of the role is really vast and important. So you need to pick good people,
Mm.
and you need to pick good people that are qualified, and you're picking them for the right reasons. Just given how important, right, this work is and all the things that you just mentioned, you have to have people who are intentional, who are strategic, and that leads to the next big takeaway is, damn it, be strategic. Really think about the things that you're doing, be intentional,
Yes.
jot things down, do communications, give people updates, and kind of think more about the big picture instead of these, like, this is my pet project for my administration, which is understandable, but maybe there's some balance to be had there of like things that are big picture long term, and those that are things that people can own as their like landmark initiatives, but like be more strategic, so that we're having a greater impact. And the last thing is focusing on improving systems. I definitely want to talk about this a little bit more, like that point around operationalizing. And I'm sort of envisioning like a popcorn session where we're like, okay, this is something that we're challenging. What are the things that need to come up? And I'm sure we could sit here just for an hour, just doing this like discussion type mind map, right? Of things that need to be addressed to really think about improving operations, streamlining operations so that to the points that you made, right? We're doing things thoughtfully. We have mandates. We're checking on progress. We're communicating that progress. We're connecting agencies. And then I think to your point too, right? Connecting with community leaders. So what is that relationship between agencies and those community leaders? Different stakeholders, right? In different aspects of the game. And then accounting for in some ways, right? Like flexibility, because this is a human service. Like, how do you make government more agile, right? To
Mhm.
sort of meet multiple people's needs. So thinking about like talking a bit more about systems would be really interesting for folks who work in the systems. Like I love that visual of a gear. And there's a we don't make widgets as a book, right? We make systems, not widgets, like something like that. And that's, unfortunately, a lot of times in government, it's just like a cog and like, oh, well, I can't help you thinking about like nonprofit providers. I can only do but so much, right? Because I'm this cog at the very end of the process and there's, five other cogs ahead of it. And now like the clock just isn't running, right? And those are things that I think people really don't understand. But to your point, really should be the focus because the lack of those cogs being well oiled, interconnecting, working seamlessly together, that affects so many things and can harm a lot of people. Like, even thinking just beyond like the services that people get, the people who work and don't have payment or income, and talking about their housing, right? Like, oh, we could just keep going on and on and on about the effects of things not working well. So, those are some sort of key takeaways that I have, but I think we could probably delve into even further in another combo. And I'd love to have John. He had an emergency in his family, so he couldn't make it with us today. But maybe that's something we could pick up at another time.
Yes, let's do that. Because I'd love to, be in the space to hear from John and while you were speaking, Liz, I thought about something in regards to an idea around the operationalizing and knowing that we have really good leaders and they need guidance. And I wonder if there hypothetically would be an opportunity to create an academy where those who are
Mhm.
interested in becoming more than community leaders and are interested in politics, that there's an actual academy that you go to and you are learn the same way that you would go to get your master's or get your BA, maybe a certificate type a program or maybe degree on the steps that you need to take to understand what it means to, leadership management or change management or the political system, understanding what the needs are, how to create strategic plans, how to build better partnerships, how to be able to turnkey the information. And everyone who goes through this and once they finish, then they are strategically placed, whether they're consultants or whether they become staff at a particular agency, to help build that up and make more leaders. But they also are charged to ensuring that the information comes back to the community, so they are thoroughly trained and it's an ongoing process. You're placed to provide more strength-based approaches to the work and operationalizing. It's transparent. You can see this person went through X, Y, and Z. They, scored whatever or rated in the course. So they are equipped with the knowledge. And then that's how you know, okay, this person went through this. I feel confident
Yeah.
in making my vote for that person and then seeing how I can contribute.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm gonna add a fourth takeaway,
Sorry.
which is how to no, please. I'm putting it because it's kind of came up a bit in the last episode where I did this sort of like getting to know you with John, and we had this conversation about sort of this development pipeline, right? And how development, growth opportunities, mentorship. We even talked about like professional development earlier, right? Those opportunities, how important they are for someone to stay, one to own, to grow as a professional, but really to keep them engaged, right? Like, how do you keep your workforce actively engaged? And so, like, that was something that had come up, but I love this and I agree wholeheartedly on the sort of like developing these pipelines for leadership. If you're an agency person, how can you be developed? Maybe it is your intention to go into public office or you want to move up in your organization. I don't think that we have that sort of like opportunity, or even within another agency. Like, I would say to you, I may not stay where I am, but I would totally want to pursue this kind of role. But how do I get that how do I develop those skills or make those relationships? Or if you're assuming an elected role, but in any way, I think in any capacity, those types of basic foundational skills would help you do a better job, I think. Like, how are we intentionally grooming people? I do know of like organizations that do this sort of as a in a nonprofit space, but that's, it's not enough. And also I think it would be great to your point, right? Like get people sort of vantage points from all angles, making it non-political, right? Like it doesn't have to be party based. It's
Mhm.
just, being a good human based. And if you're working in human services, you kind of need to know all these things. So I put that down as like as a fourth sort of takeaway. And another thing I think we should delve into a little bit more is, again, how are we developing and grooming leadership,
Leadership. Mhm.
not for, you know, um, forgive me, but again, how do people take certain on roles? We're not grooming leadership for people to take on roles for ego or
Mhm.
self-service, but grooming them because we know that they have the skills to fit into, right? Like this broader vision and impact that we can have in the city. Um, and sometimes I think a lot of people who have those skill sets are totally ignored because they don't have that external extrovert persona to assume some of these roles, but that doesn't mean that they shouldn't be at the table, right? So I absolutely freaking love that. Just gonna say.
Thank you, thank you.
Awesome. Okay. See, this is why I love you and why I love these discussions because, I think you're hearing it from people who have seen it. And I also know some of the work that you do too. I've done it as well, being on the receiving end of people who are just utterly frustrated when they're asking you for something. I think we've both been in those conversations when you're in the community and you're either talking to parents, community members, young people who are just so perturbed and don't buy into the bullshit of the bureaucracy because they don't understand why you don't have an answer or why something hasn't happened. And so we know sort of firsthand, again, a lot of people who are in city government or who work in even nonprofits, I'll put them in that category too, right? I feel like they're just contracted civil servants in a way. There's so much that you see and you encounter on a day to day that people don't really know. And if they don't hear and they don't experience and they don't have all the information to, I think, have like a really well informed perspective on a certain, on the world, right? Which is city government, I think, and beyond. So this was awesome.
I
I love
concur.
it. Yay. So I hope you'll be back on, hopefully
Yeah.
sometime soon. But I thank you for being here for the first time and hopefully you'll be the first of many. So thank you so much.
Thank you.